My children, David and Clara, spoke so convincingly. Their voices, which I had once taught to speak their first words, now painted a picture of my madness in the cold courtroom. I, Arthur Pendleton, 82 years old, a former forensic auditor, sat in silence, observing. I saw not grief, but desperation in their eyes. They lied not out of malice, but out of a fear born from mountains of debt. But they had forgotten the main lesson I had taught them. Every number tells a story. My silent defense was not in words. It was in the sealed envelope that lay in my pocket, an audit of their lives, cold and irrefutable. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. The room was designed to diminish the individual. High ceilings vaulted into shadow, drawing the eye upward, away from the human drama unfolding below. The walls were clad in panels of dark, somber wood, and the air itself felt heavy, tasting of old paper, floor polish, and the faint metallic scent of anxiety. I, Arthur Pendleton, 82 years of age, sat perfectly still on a hard wooden bench. For 5 decades of my life, as a forensic auditor, I had occupied rooms like this: boardrooms, hearing rooms, courtrooms, places where narratives were constructed and deconstructed, where truth was a commodity to be sifted from mountains of carefully curated falsehoods. The irony that I was now the subject of the audit, the central column in a ledger being filled with fraudulent entries, was not lost on me. It was simply the final, unexpected variable in a long and complex equation. My hands rested on my knees, my posture erect. I kept my breathing even and slow, a deliberate, conscious act of control in a situation designed to strip me of it. Across the room, my children, David and Clara, sat beside their lawyer. I observed them with the same dispassionate focus I had once reserved for a dubious balance sheet. I noted the way David's expensive suit, intended to project an image of sober responsibility, was just a little too tight across the shoulders, a sign of recent weight gain, of stress. I saw how Clara repeatedly touched a delicate pearl necklace, one that had belonged to her mother, my late wife, Martha, a prop meant to signify her connection to our family's sentimental history, a history she was now actively trying to rewrite. Their lawyer was a young man with sharp, hungry eyes and a suit that cost more than my first car. He arranged his papers with a theatrical precision, a performance of competence I had seen 100 times before. They were all playing their parts. The judge, a man named Wallace, sat elevated before us, a figure draped in black robes and the weary authority of his office. I audited him as well. I saw the way his eyes, tired and netted with fine lines, scanned each document before him. I noted the methodical arrangement of his desk, a carafe of water, a notepad aligned perfectly with the edge of the blotter, a single sharpened pencil. He was a man of process and order. This was a good thing. A man who respected process could be made to see a flaw in it, provided the evidence of that flaw was presented in a language he understood. My entire life had been a study in that language, the cold, irrefutable grammar of facts. When the proceedings began, the silence was broken by the lawyer's smooth, practiced voice. I did not focus on his words, which were merely the packaging, the ornamental flourishes on the lies to come. I focused on the data points, the subtle shift in Clara's posture as she prepared to take the stand, the way David nervously cleared his throat, the almost imperceptible nod the lawyer gave them both, a final stage direction before the curtain rose. They were my children. I had held their hands, taught them to read, and explained to them the simple, immutable beauty of compound interest. Now they were strangers, witnesses for a prosecution whose sole aim was the erasure of my identity. Clara was first. She walked to the witness stand, her steps measured, her face a mask of tragic reluctance. I watched her as one might watch a specimen under a microscope. I saw the calculated tremor in her hand as she swore the oath. I saw the single perfect tear that escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek as she began to speak. I did not hear the story she was telling the court. I heard the subtext. I had the original records of her life stored in my memory, and I could see every deviation, every falsified entry she was now making in this public ledger. I remembered her fierce, independent spirit as a girl, a spirit that had, over the years, curdled into a desperate entitlement. The grief she was performing was real in a way. It was the grief for a lifestyle she could no longer afford. Then came David. He strode to the stand with an air of grim, paternalistic duty. His performance was less emotional, more grounded in the language of finance and logic, my language, now twisted and used as a weapon against me. He spoke of my erratic investments and fiscal irresponsibility. He presented documents, utility bills I had supposedly forgotten to pay, statements from accounts I had allegedly mismanaged. I recognized them. They were carefully selected, isolated data points presented without context, the classic tactic of a fraudulent report. He was using the very analytical tools I had taught him to construct a narrative of my incompetence. The betrayal was not just in the act, but in the methodology. He was using my own life's work to dismantle me. I sat through it all, my expression unchanged. The sting was there, a deep, cold ache beneath my ribs, but an auditor does not react to the data. He simply records it, analyzes it, and waits for the moment to present his findings. And I knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the marble walls around me, that my moment would come. Clara took the stand first. She moved with a practiced fragility, as if a sudden breeze might shatter her. Her entire being was a carefully constructed performance of sorrow. From my bench, I had a clear and unobstructed view, and my mind, unburdened by the need to speak, became a relentless recording instrument. I catalogued every detail, the subtle, artful smudging of her mascara to give the impression of recent tears, the way she clutched a lace handkerchief in her hand, a prop from another, more sentimental era. Her lawyer guided her with a gentle, almost invisible hand, his questions soft and leading, designed not to elicit facts, but to sculpt a narrative. And Clara, my daughter, began to sculpt. She wove a tapestry of my supposed decline, her voice a soft, trembling thread. She spoke of recent events, twisting them with a breathtaking skill. An anecdote about a misplaced set of car keys became a 20-minute saga of my escalating paranoia and baseless accusations. I remembered the incident with perfect eidetic clarity. The keys had been in the pocket of the gardening coat she herself had borrowed and returned to the wrong closet. My discovery of them there wasn't paranoia. It was simple, methodical searching. But in her telling, the story was transformed. My calm, logical process of elimination became the frantic, delusional rummaging of a madman. She recounted another story, this one of my forgetfulness, describing an afternoon where I had failed to remember a lunch appointment we had scheduled. As she spoke, the memory of that day returned to me, pristine and uncorrupted. She had called that morning to cancel, her voice rushed, mentioning a last-minute opportunity to network with a potential client for her failing interior design business. My afternoon had not been forgotten. It had been freed. Her lie was not an exaggeration. It was a complete and total fabrication, a piece of fiction presented as sworn testimony. She punctuated these stories with pauses, dabbing at her eyes with the handkerchief, allowing the weight of her fabrications to settle in the silent room. After the court took a brief recess, it was David's turn. Where Clara's performance had been one of emotional fragility, his was a masterpiece of reluctant, masculine duty. He sat solidly in the witness chair, his hands clasped before him, his brow furrowed with a convincing semblance of filial concern. His voice was steady, resonant, the voice of a man of business, a man of facts. And he had brought documents. His lawyer entered them into evidence, one by one. Large manila envelopes passed from the bar to the clerk, and then to the judge. David's testimony was a clinical dissection of my financial life, designed to portray me as an incompetent, erratic old man squandering his legacy. He began with a series of my bank statements, using a laser pointer to highlight specific withdrawals. He described them as impulsive, inexplicable expenditures, evidence of a mind no longer capable of rational financial planning. One such withdrawal, for a significant sum, he presented with particular gravity. I did not need to see the statement to know the exact transaction. It was the tuition payment for his own son's, my grandson's, final semester at university, a payment David had been unable to make himself. I had written the check directly to the bursar's office, a discreet act of support he had begged me to provide, swearing it would be the last time. Now, he presented this act of grandfatherly love as a symptom of my insanity. Another document he produced was a letter from my stockbroker. He read from it, his tone somber, describing a recent sale of long-held blue-chip stocks. He framed this as a reckless gamble, a sign of my deteriorating judgment. He omitted the context, that I had sold those specific stocks at their peak value to fund a new wing for the local public library, a project Martha and I had planned together for years. The library had held a small ceremony in my honor. David had sent his regrets. He was too busy to attend. He presented my philanthropy as pathology, my careful, planned generosity as the reckless whim of a doddering fool. Throughout his testimony, I watched his left hand. His fingers rhythmically tapped against his thigh, a nervous tell he'd had since he was a boy, a tic that appeared only when he was lying. It was a small, almost invisible data point, but for an auditor, it was as conclusive as a forged signature. The taxi ride home was a journey through a landscape I did not see. The familiar streets of my city, the blur of pedestrians and traffic, were nothing more than a muted, gray film spooling past the window. My awareness had collapsed inward, contained entirely within the hollow space that had opened up inside my chest. When the car stopped before my house, I paid the driver, my movements mechanical, my hands steady. The house stood as it always had, solid and dependable, its brick facade warmed by the afternoon sun. But as I fitted the key into the lock and pushed open the heavy oak door, the silence that met me was different. It was not the familiar, comfortable silence of a quiet home. It was a profound and absolute void, a vacuum from which all warmth and life had been sucked. I stood in the foyer for a long time, letting the silence wash over me. I could hear the faint, rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the living room, a sound that had been the steady heartbeat of my life for 50 years. Now, it sounded like a countdown. I walked into the living room, my feet silent on the thick Persian rug Martha had chosen. The room was a museum of our shared life. Her reading glasses still rested on the small table beside her favorite armchair, the one with the floral print. A faint indentation, the memory of her form, was still visible in the cushions. A book lay face down on the ottoman, its page marked by a folded corner, as if she had just stepped away for a moment and would be back at any second. I ran my fingers over the worn velvet of the armchair, the fabric cool and lifeless beneath my touch. The performances I had witnessed in the courtroom had not just been an attack on me. They were a desecration of this space, a violation of the memories held within these walls. The weight of their testimony, which I had held at bay with the discipline of professional detachment, now descended upon me. Every fabricated story, every twisted truth replayed in my mind. Clara's manufactured tears, David's feigned concern, they were shards of glass working their way into my soul. I felt the identity they were trying to construct for me, the one the court was beginning to believe, a confused, incompetent, paranoid old man, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. The foundation of my own certainty, my own sense of self, began to feel like shifting sand. For a terrifying, vertiginous moment, I felt the person they described and the person I was begin to merge. Was I forgetful? Was I losing my grip? The silence of the house offered no answers. It only amplified the questions. My gaze fell upon the mantelpiece, upon the silver-framed photograph of Martha, taken on our 40th anniversary. She was smiling, her eyes bright with a love and trust that had been the bedrock of my world. Looking at her face, the emotional dam I had so carefully constructed finally broke. It was not a violent, crashing wave of grief, but a slow, cold flood of pure, undiluted sorrow. The loneliness was a physical presence, a heavy cloak that settled on my shoulders. I had lost her, and now I had lost the children she had given me. The betrayal felt absolute, a final definitive amputation from the family we had built together. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the deafening roar of everything I had lost. I do not know how long I stood there. Eventually, my legs, stiff and weary, carried me out of the living room and down the hall to my study. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The air here was different. It smelled of old leather, ink, and aging paper. This was my domain. This was the room where logic and reason had always reigned supreme. The setting sun cast long shadows across the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with legal texts, accounting standards, and the bound records of 100 complex audits. My desk, a massive block of dark mahogany, was neat and orderly, a testament to a mind that thrived on structure. As I stood in the doorway of this sanctuary of reason, I felt the cold flood of despair begin to recede. The emotional turmoil of the living room could not penetrate this space. Here, facts were paramount. I looked at the rows of closed case files on the shelves. Each one represented a story of deception, a complex web of lies I had been hired to untangle. I had faced down corporate giants and cunning fraudsters, armed with nothing but my intellect and an unwavering belief in the immutable truth of numbers. What were David and Clara compared to them? They were amateurs, their lies clumsy, their motives transparent. The sorrow did not vanish, but it began to cool, to crystallize, to harden into something else. It became a cold, clear, diamond-hard resolve. The courtroom was their stage, but the balance sheet was mine. They had presented their narrative. Now I would prepare my audit. I walked to my desk and sat down in the worn leather chair. I pulled a fresh yellow legal pad from a drawer and took out my old fountain pen. I did not write a single word. I simply sat there, in the deepening twilight, the tools of my trade before me. The plan began to form, not in a flash of inspiration, but in a slow, methodical assembly of logical steps. The silence of the house was no longer a sound of loss. It was the sound of preparation. The dawn that followed my night of grim resolve was pale and gray, the light filtering weakly through the blinds of my study. I had not slept. Instead, I had remained seated at my desk, a sentinel in the quiet dark, the unwritten legal pad and the fountain pen my silent companions. The emotional storm had passed, leaving in its wake a landscape of cold, hard clarity. Grief and betrayal were now irrelevant variables. They could not be quantified or entered into a ledger. The problem before me was one of data, and the first task of any audit was to secure and organize the primary records. Foregoing my usual morning coffee, I walked to the corner of the study where a heavy, fireproof safe was concealed behind a false panel of bookshelves. The sequence to the combination lock was as familiar to me as my own name, a series of numbers tied to dates of significance only Martha and I had known. The tumblers clicked with satisfying precision under my fingertips, a small mechanical affirmation of a memory still perfectly intact. The heavy door swung open with a low groan, revealing neat stacks of ledgers, document folders, and trust agreements, a meticulously organized archive of a lifetime of fiscal prudence. This was my financial soul, the paper record of the man my children had attempted to paint as a reckless fool. I began the process of moving the files to my desk, my movements slow but deliberate, each folder a heavy, tangible piece of my own truth. I spent the entire morning and most of the afternoon immersed in the documents. I spread them across the vast mahogany landscape of my desk, creating a chronological map of my own life. I was not searching for anything I did not already know. I was establishing a baseline, a certified, undeniable record of fact against which every lie from the previous day's testimony could be measured and exposed. My pen moved across the yellow legal pad, my handwriting small and exact. I noted the date I had paid off the mortgage on this house. I circled the dividend payments from stock portfolios I had managed for 40 years. I cross-referenced the charitable donations that David had called erratic expenditures with their corresponding tax receipts and letters of acknowledgement. I was building a fortress of facts, brick by documented brick. As I worked, I compiled a separate list on another sheet of paper. This list was not about me. It was about them. It was a list of questions, of data points I did not possess. What was the exact outstanding principal on Clara's mortgage? Who were the primary lien holders on David's failed business ventures? What lawsuits were currently pending against them in the county court? My own records provided the motive in broad strokes, but I needed the fine print. I needed dates, case numbers, and notarized signatures. My investigation had reached the limits of this house. I was an analyst without a field agent, a mind without legs. The frustration was a brief, hot flash, but it quickly subsided, replaced by a cool, strategic assessment of my own limitations. An auditor, when faced with an incomplete record, does not abandon the task. He seeks a new source of information. My mind began to inventory potential assets. Old colleagues from my firm, most were long retired or gone, scattered across the country. A private investigator? The thought was distasteful. They were mercenaries, their loyalty for sale, their methods often crude. This was not a task for a stranger. It required a delicacy and a personal commitment that money could not buy. And then, my thoughts settled on a name. A person I had not seen in months, but whose character was as solid and reliable as the stone foundation of my house. Eleanor, my dear Martha's younger sister, a woman who possessed a quiet, fierce loyalty and a mind that had been sharpened by 40 years as the head reference librarian for the city. She was a professional seeker of information, a woman who knew that every story, no matter how well hidden, left a paper trail. She had loved her sister, and she had always treated me with a respect that bordered on reverence. She would not question my sanity. She would only ask how she could help. The decision once made was absolute. I found my old, leather-bound address book in the top drawer of my desk. The book was a relic, filled with the names of friends and family, many of whom were now just memories. I flipped through the thin, brittle pages, my finger tracing down the columns until it rested on her name. The number was written in my own, younger hand. I lifted the heavy receiver of the old landline telephone on my desk. The dial tone was a steady, reassuring hum. My fingers, steady and certain, dialed the 7 numbers. I listened to the rhythmic clicks and then the ringing tone. Once, twice. The sound of a voice on the other end of the line broke the silence. I did not speak immediately. I simply took a breath, a silent confirmation to myself that the first move of the counteroffensive had just been made. I was no longer alone. The hours that followed the phone call were a quiet, focused period of preparation. I waited. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to slow, each second a deliberate, weighty thing. I did not pace or watch the window. I used the time to bring order to the chaos, to prepare the battlefield for the arrival of my reinforcements. In my study, I cleared the second chair, an old leather wingback that Martha had often sat in while I worked late into the evening. I wiped the thin film of dust from its arms and positioned it beside my own at the desk. I arranged the financial records I had reviewed into neat, logical stacks on one side of the large blotter, leaving a wide, open space of polished wood between them. On a fresh sheet of my legal pad, I began to draft a clear, concise list of the missing information, the specific public records I needed to access. I was creating a briefing room, a silent and comprehensive presentation of the facts that would require no verbal explanation. I heard the sound of her sensible 10-year-old sedan before I saw it. It was a quiet, unassuming car, much like the woman who drove it. I watched from the study window as Eleanor got out. She was 75, a few years younger than me, but moved with a librarian's quiet, purposeful energy. She wore a simple tweed coat against the autumn chill, her silver hair pulled back in a neat, no-nonsense bun. In her hand she carried not a purse, but a worn leather satchel, the kind used for carrying books and research papers. Her face was calm, her expression composed, but I knew her well enough to see the grim resolve set in her jaw. She had not come for a social visit. She had come for a briefing. I opened the front door before she had a chance to ring the bell. We did not exchange greetings. There was no need for the hollow pleasantries of a normal visit. I simply stood back and held the door open for her. She stepped inside, her sharp, intelligent eyes taking in the stillness of the house, the faint scent of dust and memory. Her gaze met mine, and in that single shared look, a volume of understanding passed between us. She saw the strain behind my composure, and I saw the unwavering loyalty in hers. It was the same loyalty she had always held for her older sister, a fierce, protective bond that had not diminished with death. I led her directly to the study. She stood in the doorway for a moment, her eyes sweeping over the desk, over the neat stacks of documents and the empty chair waiting for her. She understood immediately. This was a place of work, of war. I walked to the desk and picked up a single folded document from beside my notepad. It was the official court summons, the petition for guardianship filed by David and Clara Pendleton against Arthur Pendleton, citing reasons of cognitive decline and fiscal incompetence. I held it out to her. She took the document, her movements unhurried. She unfolded it and began to read, her posture perfectly still. I watched her face, the only part of her that betrayed any emotion. I saw her lips press into a thin, hard line. I saw a dull, angry flush creep up from her neck. Her eyes, magnified slightly by her reading glasses, became as cold and sharp as chips of flint. She read every word, every slanderous accusation, every fabricated claim. When she finished, she refolded the document with precise, angry snaps of the paper and placed it back on the desk. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her anger was a silent, incandescent thing, an offense not just against me, but against the memory of her sister, whose children were now trying to destroy the man Martha had loved. She looked from the court summons to the stacks of financial records, then to the list of questions I had prepared. Her librarian's mind instantly grasped the situation in its entirety: the attack, the evidence I possessed, and the evidence I still needed. Her decision was made in that moment. She walked past me, took off her tweed coat, and draped it neatly over the back of the wingback chair. She then sat down in the chair, pulling it closer to the desk, and looked at me, her expression now clear of everything but a focused, determined purpose. She had accepted the position. The rest of the afternoon passed in a state of near-silent, focused collaboration. I pushed the stacks of records toward her, one by one. She reviewed them, her fingers tracing the columns of numbers, her mind absorbing the data with a speed and comprehension that rivaled my own. Occasionally, She would tap a specific line item with her finger, and I would nod, sliding another corresponding file across the desk to her. We were two old professionals, falling into an easy, efficient rhythm, our shared history and purpose a shorthand that made words superfluous. She read my list of required information, and I saw her mind at work, already formulating search parameters and cross-referencing strategies. Before she left, as dusk began to settle outside, her hand rested for a moment on a small silver frame on the corner of my desk. It was a picture of her and Martha as young girls, a flicker of shared grief, a silent reaffirmation of our cause passed between us. She packed my list and a few key documents into her leather satchel. She was no longer just my sister-in-law. She was my lead investigator. Our days fell into a new, disciplined rhythm. My study, once a place of quiet reflection, became the central nervous system of an active investigation. Eleanor would arrive each morning as the sun was just beginning to burn the mist from the lawn, her leather satchel filled with notes from the previous day, and a thermos of hot black coffee that she would place on my desk without a word. Our morning briefings were silent and efficient. I would hand her a sheet from my legal pad with a new list of names to research, of public records to pull, of corporate entities to trace. She would read my notes, her brow furrowed in concentration, occasionally tapping a line for clarification, to which I would respond by sliding a supporting document across the desk. She understood the language of my investigation implicitly. She knew I was not just looking for facts. I was reconstructing a timeline of desperation, and she became a master at unearthing the precise, dated evidence I required. While she was out in the world, a ghost in the hushed halls of archives and the fluorescent hum of government offices, I worked from my command post. The laptop she had provided became my window. My fingers, accustomed to the tactile certainty of paper and ink, learned the new, slick geography of the keyboard and trackpad. I descended into the digital archives, my auditor's mind applying its old, methodical principles to this new frontier of information. I sifted through the archives of local newspapers, searching for announcements of business launches and partnerships, which I then cross-referenced with the dates of their eventual quiet collapses. I navigated the labyrinth of social media, an alien world of curated images and hollow boasts. I watched my children perform their lives for an unseen audience, cataloging the expensive vacations, the new cars, the lavish parties, each one a data point that, when set against the timeline of their mounting debts, painted a damning picture of their recklessness. In my mind, I would follow Eleanor on her daily excursions. I pictured her in the dusty, climate-controlled basement of the county records office, her posture perfect as she scrolled through reels of microfiche, her eyes scanning deeds and liens with a librarian's practiced speed. I saw her in the law library downtown, her face illuminated by the green glow of a terminal as she navigated the complex search functions of legal databases, pulling up lawsuits and judgments that my children had believed were buried in obscurity. She was a phantom, leaving no trace, her inquiries cloaked in the anonymous, legitimate research of a retired academic. Each evening, she would return, and the true work would begin. She would unpack her satchel, and the fruits of her labor would spread across my desk. It was a harvest of my children's failures. One evening, it was a thick sheaf of photocopied documents detailing a lien placed on Clara's house by a home renovation contractor who had never been paid. I remembered the lavish dinner party Clara had thrown to show off her new kitchen, an event she had described to me over the phone in breathless, triumphant detail. Another night, Eleanor produced the incorporation papers for 3 of David's failed tech startups. Laid side by side, they showed a clear, repeating pattern. A burst of initial investment, a period of extravagant marketing expenditure, followed by a quiet dissolution, with the investors left holding nothing. As I examined a particularly damning set of credit card statements Eleanor had managed to procure through a research database. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. I saw David and Clara, teenagers, sitting across from me at this very desk. I was explaining the simple, brutal mathematics of compound interest on debt, using one of their own credit card bills as an example. I had drawn them a chart showing how a small, unpaid balance could metastasize over time into an insurmountable burden. David had been bored, impatient. Clara had seemed to understand, but the lesson had clearly not taken root. The memory was a bitter counterpoint to the papers in my hand. They had not just ignored my lessons. They had lived their lives in a state of active rebellion against the foundational principles of stability and foresight I had tried to give them. The pile of evidence grew. The paper trail was no longer a faint, speculative path. It was a broad, deeply rutted road, and at its end was a single, unavoidable destination: financial ruin. We had unearthed judgments from suppliers, default notices from banks, and even a small claims court filing from their own children's private school for unpaid tuition. Each document was a stone, and I was using them to build a case as solid and inescapable as a prison wall. We were no longer just defending against their lies. We were building a comprehensive, factual narrative of our own, a story told in the cold, unforgiving language of numbers. The acquisition of raw data was complete. My study, once a sanctuary of quiet order, now resembled the back room of a frantic corporate audit. The great mahogany desk was no longer visible, buried beneath a chaotic landscape of paper. There were stacks of photocopied court filings, curled scrolls of architectural blueprints for failed projects, stapled sheaves of bank statements, and loose, grim notices of default. It was a mosaic of my children's hidden lives, a testament to years of poor decisions and desperate gambles. The task before us now was not one of discovery, but of synthesis. It was time to take this chaotic jumble of facts and forge it into a single, coherent, and inescapable narrative. It was time to build the dossier. Our work shifted from the external world to the confines of this room. Eleanor and I became a self-contained unit, two halves of a single analytical engine. I was the chief auditor, and she was my lead verifier. I began the process by imposing a system, a structure upon which the truth could be built. I designated separate corners of the desk for each of my children. All of David's failed ventures, his lawsuits, his personal debts, went into one quadrant. All of Clara's extravagant credit card statements, her second mortgage documents, her unpaid bills from contractors, went into another. A third section was for their joint follies, the ill-advised real estate schemes they had entered into together. Slowly, out of the chaos, a semblance of order began to emerge. My days were spent in a state of intense, unbroken concentration. I took each document, one by one, and analyzed it with the same dispassionate scrutiny I had once applied to the books of multinational corporations. With my old fountain pen, its nib scratching softly against the paper, I began to annotate. In the margins of a bank statement showing a massive expenditure, I would note the date and cross-reference it with a social media post Eleanor had found, showing Clara at a charity gala wearing a designer gown. Beside a line item in David's business ledger showing a large consulting fee, I would add a note referencing the lawsuit from an investor who claimed that very fee was part of a fraudulent scheme. I was not merely collecting facts. I was connecting them, weaving the disparate threads of their lives into a single, undeniable tapestry of deceit and desperation. Eleanor worked beside me in quiet, efficient harmony. She took on the painstaking task of organizing the physical evidence. She sourced archival-quality plastic sleeves for each document, protecting them from damage. She created a numerical system, labeling each piece of evidence with a small, neat sticker. Exhibit 1, Clara's default notice. Exhibit 2, David's business bankruptcy filing, and so on. Her librarian's mind created a flawless system of cataloging, that would be instantly legible to any legal professional. She was the curator of our museum of evidence. While I provided the analysis, she ensured its presentation would be impeccable, its logic unassailable. The centerpiece of the entire dossier was the summary report. I spent 2 full days composing it. I did not write it as a betrayed father, but as Arthur Pendleton, forensic auditor. The language was cold, precise, and devoid of emotion. It began with a simple statement of purpose. An analysis of the financial standing of the petitioners, David Pendleton and Clara Pendleton, in the matter of the guardianship of Arthur Pendleton. It was divided into sections, each one corresponding to a category of evidence. I outlined their combined net worth, which, according to my calculations based on the evidence, was deeply negative. I detailed their total liabilities, a staggering figure that explained the motive for their actions with a brutal, mathematical clarity. Every claim I made in the summary was followed by a parenthetical reference to the corresponding exhibit number in the dossier. It was a dense, factual, and utterly damning document, a professional indictment from which there was no appeal. As I finished writing the final sentence of the report, I looked up at Eleanor. She was holding the photograph of her and Martha as young girls, wiping a speck of dust from the glass with the sleeve of her sweater. Our eyes met, and in that silent glance, we acknowledged the grim finality of our work. This dossier was more than just a legal defense. It was an obituary for the family I once had. I took all the sleeved documents, now perfectly ordered, and the summary report, and I slid them into a heavy, unassuming manila folder. The folder, which had been light and flimsy a week ago, was now thick and dense. It felt heavy in my hands, heavy with the weight of consequence, heavy with the unvarnished truth. The weapon was forged. It was complete. The dossier, as it was, presented a compelling and damning picture of motive. It was a meticulously documented account of a slow-motion financial collapse, a story told in the cold, hard language of default notices and court summons. Any logical observer, upon reviewing the evidence, would conclude that my children's actions were born of a desperate, all-consuming need for my estate. Yet, as I sat at my desk in the quiet of a new morning, reviewing the perfectly ordered pages, my auditor's instincts told me a crucial piece was still missing. The evidence was powerful, but it was, in a legal sense, circumstantial. It was the why, but not the how. It established their desperation, but it did not, in and of itself, prove their explicit intent to defraud. A skilled lawyer could still attempt to frame their actions as the misguided fumblings of children worried for their father's well-being, their own financial troubles an unfortunate, but separate, matter. I needed a keystone, a single irrefutable document that bridged the gap between their financial ruin and their attack on my personhood. My mind began to run calculations, to search for the weakest point in their strategy, the place where their desperation would have made them reckless. They were not patient people. The court proceedings were a slow, uncertain process. It was inconceivable to me that they would simply wait for a verdict while their own financial worlds burned to the ground. A truly desperate person, I knew from long experience, does not wait for permission. They act. They would have tried to access my assets preemptively. And my largest, most tangible asset was not my investment portfolio, but the house I was sitting in, a property free of any mortgage, a prize of immense value in the open market. When Eleanor arrived that morning, I did not hand her a list. I handed her a single sheet of paper with my own address written at the top. Below it, I had written a series of keywords for her to investigate: title searches, credit inquiries, loan applications, powers of attorney. It was a new, more dangerous line of inquiry. We were no longer just looking at their past failures. We were searching for their present crimes. She read the note, and I saw a flicker of understanding, and perhaps apprehension, in her eyes. This was no longer a matter of digging through public archives. This required a more delicate touch, a deeper search into the private ledgers of banks and credit agencies. She gave me a single, decisive nod, placed the note in her satchel, and left without a word. The day she spent on this task was the longest of my life. I sat in my study, the nearly complete dossier on my desk, feeling impotent, a powerful weapon without its final, critical component. I was unable to focus on reading, unable to do anything but wait. The ticking of the clock was a slow, torturous metronome, each tick a reminder of my own helplessness, my complete dependence on her skill and discretion. I pictured her navigating a world of bureaucracy and suspicion, a quiet, elderly woman asking questions that could raise alarms. The risk was enormous. If she were discovered, our entire counter-investigation could be exposed, my carefully constructed advantage lost in an instant. She returned late in the afternoon, as the light outside was beginning to fade. She looked tired, the lines around her eyes deeper than usual. She did not carry her usual collection of photocopied documents. She placed a single plain brown envelope on the polished surface of my desk. Her hand trembled slightly as she withdrew it. We both looked at the envelope for a long moment. It was thin, unassuming, but it felt like the heaviest object in the room. My own hand was perfectly steady as I reached for it, my years of professional composure a shield against the turmoil I felt inside. I slid my finger under the flap and broke the seal. The contents consisted of 3 pages stapled together. It was a copy of a commercial loan application submitted to a private lender 3 months prior. The applicants were listed clearly at the top: David Pendleton and Clara Pendleton. I scanned the figures. The amount of the loan they had requested was a large, specific number. I turned to my own notes, to my calculation of their combined, immediate liabilities. The numbers matched to within a few $100s. This was not a business loan. This was a bailout. My eyes moved to the section detailing the proposed collateral. My breath caught in my chest. There it was, my address, the legal description of my property, the home Martha and I had built over 50 years. Then I saw the final page. It was a copy of a durable power of attorney, granting David and Clara complete control over all my assets and affairs. And at the bottom, above the signature line for the principal, was my own name. It was a forgery, a clumsy, amateurish one, but a forgery nonetheless. I could see the hesitation in the upstroke of the A in Arthur, the unnatural pressure on the P in Pendleton. It was the desperate scrawl of a person trying to imitate a hand they did not understand. In that single fraudulent signature, all the pieces clicked into place. This was the keystone. This was the turning point. The case was no longer about my competence. It was about their crime. I took the 3 pages, slid them into a fresh plastic sleeve, and placed them at the very back of the dossier, the final, definitive chapter in the story. The discovery of the forged loan application was the final, critical gear clicking into place. The machine we had been building was now complete. All the subsequent days leading up to the final hearing were dedicated not to further investigation, but to the meticulous, almost ceremonial process of assembly and refinement. The scattered piles of evidence were gone, replaced by a single formidable stack of sleeved documents on the center of my desk. My study was no longer a workshop of discovery. It was an armory, and we were preparing our single devastating piece of ordnance for deployment. I began by rewriting my summary report. The first draft had been a powerful argument for their motive. The final version would be an irrefutable indictment of their crime. I incorporated the loan application and the forged power of attorney as the final, climactic exhibits. My language remained cold and factual, but the narrative now had a sharp, lethal point. It no longer concluded with their desperation. It concluded with their felony. I described the forgery with the clinical precision of an expert witness, pointing out the telltale signs of a fraudulent signature, the inconsistencies in pressure and flow that I could see as clearly as if I had watched them form the letters themselves. The report was no longer a shield. It was a sharpened spear. With the final report written, the great task of assembling the weapon itself began. Eleanor and I worked in tandem, a silent, seamless partnership. We laid out every single document in the correct numerical order on the long dining room table, its polished surface reflecting the grim gallery of my children's deceit. We reviewed each page, checking for smudges, ensuring the photocopies were crisp and legible, confirming that our exhibit labels were perfectly aligned. It was the quality control phase of our operation, a final, painstaking review to ensure there were no flaws, no weaknesses that a clever lawyer could exploit. We were treating the dossier as if it were a legal filing of our own, subject to the highest standards of scrutiny. I then spent an entire day reading the dossier from start to finish, as if I were Judge Wallace himself. I sat not at my own desk, but in a different chair, trying to inhabit an external, impartial perspective. I read through Clara's documented lies, cross-referencing them with the evidence of her staggering debts. I followed the paper trail of David's business collapses, his trail of angry investors and defaulted loans. I felt the weight of the evidence build, page by methodical page, creating a crushing, inescapable burden of proof. Finally, I came to the last section, the loan application, the forgery. I saw it as a judge would see it, the final audacious act of two cornered animals, a clear and unambiguous crime. I closed the folder, satisfied. The weapon was sound. The logic was unbreakable. The final act of preparation was the physical assembly. I took the thick stack of sleeved pages, their edges perfectly aligned. The report, printed on heavy bond paper, served as the cover. I secured the entire document with a heavy-duty binding clip, its steel jaws clamping down with a satisfyingly solid snap. The dossier was now a single, unified object. It was heavy, nearly 2 inches thick, a dense brick of meticulously organized truth. I picked it up, feeling its heft in my hands. It felt like a gravestone. Eleanor stood by, a silent witness to the process. She had brought a large new manila envelope, the kind used for legal documents, sturdy and opaque. She held it open for me. I did not hesitate. I slid the dossier into the envelope. The fit was snug. I folded down the heavy flap, its crease sharp and absolute. The metal clasp was stiff, and I pressed it down firmly, the two prongs piercing the paper and folding over with a final, soft, metallic click. It was done. The weapon was armed and sealed. On the last evening before the hearing, Eleanor went home. She placed a hand on my shoulder before she left, a brief, warm pressure of solidarity, and then she was gone. I was alone with the sealed envelope. I did not pace. I did not agonize. The time for that was long past. I locked the dossier away in my safe, a final act of security. Then I walked into the dark living room and sat in Martha's chair, the scent of her a faint, comforting memory in the old fabric. I did not turn on any lights. I simply sat in the encroaching darkness, watching the last of the evening light fade from the sky. My mind was quiet, my emotions still. I was a general on the eve of a battle for which he was perfectly prepared, a battle whose outcome was already a foregone conclusion. There was no joy in what I was about to do, no thrill of victory. There was only a profound and cold sense of finality, a necessary, painful, and absolute end. The front door clicked shut, and with Eleanor's departure, a new and final kind of silence settled over the house. The work was finished. The last piece of evidence had been catalogued, the final sentence of my report written. The dossier, a dense and heavy object sealed within its plain manila envelope, now lay on the blotter of my desk. It was no longer a project. It was a fact, a tangible and complete truth waiting for its moment to be entered into the public record. My first act in this new silence was to secure it. I walked to the corner of the study, opened the hidden safe, and placed the envelope inside. I did not place it alongside my financial records or my will. I laid it on a shelf by itself. It was a singular object, and it deserved its own space. The heavy door swung shut, the tumblers of the lock clicking into place with the sound of absolute finality. The weapon was now locked away, ready for the morning. With the dossier secured, my mind was, for the first time in weeks, quiet. There were no more calculations to run, no more records to cross-reference. All that remained was the waiting. I did not spend the evening in my study. My work there was done. Instead, I began a slow, deliberate walk through the rooms of my house, a final silent pilgrimage through the museum of my life. I moved through the living room, my fingers brushing against the cool, smooth keys of the piano that Martha had loved to play. I stood before the fireplace, my eyes tracing the lines of her face in our wedding photograph, her smile a beacon from a distant, more innocent shore. The profound sense of sorrow that had once overwhelmed me in this room was now a distant echo, a cold and settled thing at the bottom of my soul. My journey took me upstairs. I pushed open the door to the room that had once been David's. It was a guest room now, impersonal and neat, but the ghosts of his boyhood were still there if one knew where to look. I ran my hand along the doorframe, my fingers finding the faint horizontal pencil marks that had tracked his growth from a small boy into a lanky teenager. I could still see the faint outline of a poster he had taped to the wall, a ghostly rectangle where a picture of a baseball player had once hung. In that room, I felt the memory of a boy who had been full of loud, boisterous life, a boy who had once followed me around the yard, his small hand clutching my finger. I felt no anger toward that boy, only a deep and bottomless pity for the desperate, dishonest man he had become. Then I crossed the hall to Clara's room. It was much the same, a guest room painted a neutral shade of beige. But in the back of the closet, I knew a small wooden chest still remained. I knelt, my old joints protesting, and lifted the heavy lid. The scent of cedar and thyme rose up to meet me. Inside were the carefully preserved relics of her childhood, a pair of worn ballet slippers, a collection of glass animals, a diary bound in faded pink leather. I picked up one of the glass figures, a tiny, perfect deer. I remembered the day I had bought it for her at a county fair. She had been inconsolable after dropping and breaking a different one, and I had spent an hour searching for an exact replacement. Her tear-streaked face, when I had presented it to her, had transformed into a smile of pure, unadulterated adoration. I held the cold, delicate object in the palm of my hand, a perfect, beautiful thing from a life that no longer existed. This was the final audit, the closing of the books on my own fatherhood. I was saying goodbye not to my children as they were now, but to the memory of the children they had once been. I gently placed the glass deer back in the chest and closed the lid. I finished my tour back in my own bedroom, where a larger photograph of Martha sat on my dresser. I stood before it in the gathering dark, the last of the sun's rays painting the room in shades of orange and gray. I looked into her eyes, and in the silent theater of my mind, I presented my case. I laid out the facts for her, the cold, hard numbers, the deliberate lies, the final damning forgery. I explained the choice I had made, the path I was now set upon. I was not seeking her permission or her forgiveness. I was simply reporting my findings to my only true partner, the one person whose judgment I had ever trusted implicitly. And in the quiet, steady gaze of her photograph, I found not an answer, but a sense of profound, unwavering peace. She had been a woman of immense integrity, and I knew, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, that she would have understood. Later, I went about the methodical, grounding rituals of preparing for the next day. I laid out my best suit, the dark gray one I reserved for funerals and the most serious of business meetings. I polished my black leather shoes until they shone with a deep, somber luster. I set my alarm clock for an early hour. Each action was deliberate, a small piece of order asserted against the impending chaos. There was no anxiety, no fear. There was only the calm. I sat for a final hour in my study chair, in the complete darkness, not thinking, not remembering, but simply being. I was an instrument of the facts that I had gathered. I was the delivery mechanism for a truth that could no longer be contained. The storm would break in the morning. But tonight, in the silent, waiting heart of my house, there was only a quiet, final, and absolute calm. The return to the courtroom was like stepping back onto a stage for the final act of a play. The set was the same: the cold marble, the dark wood, the imposing height of the judge's bench. The air was still thick with the same sterile, legalistic odor, but I was no longer the same actor. On the first day, I had been the subject, the passive object of the court's inquiry. Today, I was an agent. I walked into the room with the quiet, unassailable confidence of an auditor who knows his final report is flawless. In the worn leather briefcase I carried, the sealed manila envelope rested, its weight a dense and reassuring presence, a tangible anchor of fact in an ocean of lies. I took my seat and observed the other players. My children, David and Clara, sat with their lawyer, their heads close together in a final, hushed conference. I saw the confident set of David's shoulders, the small anticipatory smile playing on Clara's lips. They saw the finish line. They believed they had run their race with skill, that their narrative had been accepted, and that all that remained was the formality of the judge's ruling. Their lawyer, a young man flush with the belief of his own impending victory, arranged his papers with a flourish. They were all so certain. It was the fatal flaw of every dishonest accountant and corrupt executive I had ever audited, an arrogance born from the belief that their version of reality was the only one that mattered. The proceedings began. Their lawyer delivered his closing arguments. I listened to the well-rehearsed speech, a symphony of feigned compassion and manufactured concern. He painted a vivid picture of my supposed vulnerability, my isolation, my confusion. He used words like dignity and protection, arguing that the only humane course of action was to place me in the care of my loving, devoted children. He was a skilled orator. His voice resonated with emotion. His gestures were broad and sincere. He was building a beautiful, elaborate house of cards upon a foundation of sand. As he spoke, I looked at my children. I saw Clara dab at a dry eye with her handkerchief. I saw David nod slowly, his expression a mask of solemn, dutiful agreement. The performance was flawless to the very end. When he finished, a profound silence descended upon the courtroom. The lawyer sat down, a look of deep satisfaction on his face. The work was done. The case was made. All eyes in the room, the judges, the clerks, my children's, turned to me. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment the doddering old fool would be given a chance to speak and, in his incoherent ramblings, confirm everything they had just testified to. I felt the collective weight of their expectation. Judge Wallace looked down at me from his elevated bench. The look in his eyes was not unkind. It was one of weary duty, of a man about to perform a necessary but unpleasant task. His voice was even, formal, as he addressed me. He informed me that the petitioners had rested their case. He then asked if I had anything to say in my own defense, any final word I wished to offer the court before he made his decision. The silence that followed his question was absolute. I held it for 3 full heartbeats. Then I placed my hands on the arms of my chair and, with a smooth, deliberate motion that belied the frail character my children had invented, I rose to my feet. A gasp, small and sharp, came from Clara. David's confident posture stiffened, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. I did not look at them. My focus was entirely on the judge. I began to walk. My steps were not the shuffle of a feeble man, but the steady, measured pace of a professional with a purpose. The sound of my leather-soled shoes on the marble floor was the only sound in the cavernous room. It was a long walk, from my table to the foot of the judge's bench, a journey through a sea of stunned, silent faces. I reached the bench and stopped. I placed my briefcase on the smooth wooden ledge. I did not fumble with the latches. My hands were steady. I opened the case and retrieved the sealed manila envelope. I held it for a moment, letting the court see it. It was plain, heavy, and official. It was nothing, and it was everything. I then placed the envelope directly in the center of the bench in front of the judge. I slid it forward a few inches, a simple final gesture of presentation. My eyes met Judge Wallace's. I held his gaze, and in that silent, unwavering look, I communicated everything I needed to say. My testimony is in this envelope. The audit is complete. I gave a single slow nod, a gesture of finality and respect for his office. Then I turned my back on the bench and began the long walk back to my seat. The shock in the room had deepened into a palpable, vibrating state of confusion. I could feel the frantic, questioning stares of my children on my back. I reached my chair and sat down, my hands returning to their calm, still position on my knees. I had not uttered a single word. My final statement had been made. I looked up at the judge. He was staring down at the sealed envelope as if it were a strange and potentially dangerous artifact that had appeared from nowhere. He tentatively reached out and placed his hand on it, his fingers registering its unexpected weight. The house of cards was still standing, but the table upon which it was built had begun to shake. The silence in the courtroom was a tangible thing, a heavy, pressurized atmosphere that seemed to rob the very air of its buoyancy. All movement had ceased. The world had narrowed to the space between my seat and the judge's bench, and the single plain envelope that now occupied it. I watched Judge Wallace. He looked down at the envelope, then at me, a flicker of profound uncertainty in his tired eyes. He had expected words, a rambling defense or a confused plea. He had been presented with a sealed object, an anomaly in the rigid procedures of his court. For a long moment, he did not move. Then, with the slow, deliberate motion of a man defusing a bomb, he reached out, took the envelope, and turned it over in his hands, feeling its weight. He picked up a long silver letter opener from his desk. The slide of the blade under the flap was the first sharp, distinct sound in what felt like an eternity. He slit the envelope open with a clean, decisive rip and tilted it, allowing the thick dossier to slide out onto his blotter. Its sheer volume, the professional, almost clinical way it was bound and tabbed, instantly dispelled any notion that it might be the incoherent scribblings of a senile mind. This was a formal document. The judge's expression shifted from weary pity to sharp, focused curiosity. He adjusted his reading glasses and picked up the dossier, his eyes landing on the first page, my summary report. I did not watch my children. My focus was entirely on the judge. I was an auditor, and he was my client. I was presenting my findings, and I needed to observe his reaction to the data. In the first few minutes, I saw his brow furrow in concentration. His gaze, which had been passive, became active, analytical. He sat up straighter in his high-backed chair. He was no longer presiding over a sad family drama. He was reading a complex financial statement. He finished the summary page, and his eyes, for a brief moment, darted over the top of the dossier to look at David and Clara. It was a quick, reassessing glance, the first sign that the foundation of the case was beginning to crack. He began to turn the pages, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. He was no longer just reading. He was consuming information. I knew the narrative he was following, the one I had so carefully constructed. He was witnessing the methodical documentation of their debts, the cascading series of defaults, the lawsuits. I saw his lips thin into a hard, straight line. The initial curiosity on his face was now being replaced by a stern, judicial coldness. The pity was gone, burned away by the hard, unforgiving light of the facts. He looked at my children again, and this time, his gaze lingered. It was a look stripped of all sympathy, a look of pure, professional scrutiny. I allowed myself a glance at David and Clara. Their confidence had evaporated, replaced by a nervous, twitching anxiety. They were whispering frantically to their lawyer, who could only offer a helpless shrug, his own face a mask of baffled confusion. They had come prepared for a battle of emotion and testimony. They were completely unarmed for a battle of evidence. They watched the judge's face as if their lives depended on it. And in a way, they did. They were watching their own careful performance, their entire constructed reality, being dismantled page by page. Then I saw the judge's hand freeze. He had reached the final section. He had reached the copy of the loan application. His body went rigid. I saw him lean closer to the page, his eyes narrowing. He was looking at the forgery. He read the document once, then a second time, his knuckles white as he gripped the dossier. His head came up slowly, his eyes lifting from the page to find my children. The look on his face was no longer just stern or cold. It was one of utter, undisguised contempt. In that moment, he was not just a judge in a guardianship hearing. He was an officer of the court looking at two individuals who had attempted to perpetrate a fraud within his own jurisdiction. The end came swiftly. Judge Wallace did not look at their lawyer. He did not ask for a rebuttal. The facts in the folder were absolute. He closed the dossier, the sound of the thick cover slapping against the pages a sharp, definitive report in the silent room. He aligned it perfectly with the edge of his desk blotter, an act of restoring order. Then he picked up his wooden gavel. He did not bang it repeatedly. He lifted it high and brought it down once. The crack of wood against wood was like a gunshot, a violent final sound that shattered the last remnants of my children's hope. He made a short, sharp, dismissive gesture with his hand, a universal sign for a matter concluded and thrown out. He rose from his seat and was gone from the bench without a backward glance. The aftermath was a scene of quiet, panicked collapse. The lawyer, his face pale, began to shove his papers into his briefcase with clumsy, trembling hands. Clara was frozen, her face a mask of blank, white shock. David, his face slick with a sheen of sweat, grabbed her by the arm, pulling her roughly to her feet. They did not look at me. They could not. They fled the courtroom, a hurried, humiliating retreat, their lies and their arrogance left in a heap on the floor behind them. I remained seated, a still point in the emptying room, the echo of the gavel still ringing in my ears. The books were now balanced. The audit was closed. I walked out of the courthouse alone. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind me, muffling the sterile silence of the marble halls and leaving me on the sun-drenched steps, blinking in the bright, indifferent light of a Tuesday afternoon. The sounds of the city, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of traffic, the murmur of unseen crowds, rushed in to fill the vacuum. Eleanor was waiting for me at the bottom of the steps, her posture straight, her expression unreadable but for the quiet relief in her eyes. She had been my silent, steadfast partner, my only ally in a war waged in whispers and paper. I met her gaze and gave a single slow nod, a gesture of gratitude that transcended any words I could have offered. She nodded in return. She understood. With a small, almost imperceptible gesture, I indicated my desire to walk home alone. She understood that, too. She simply watched as I turned and began my solitary journey, a general leaving the field after the final, costly battle. The walk was long, and I took it slowly, my body feeling the immense weight of the preceding weeks for the first time. The city I walked through was the same one I had lived in my entire adult life, but it felt new, its colors more vivid, its textures more pronounced. I noticed the intricate stonework on an old bank building, the way the autumn leaves skittered across the pavement, the faces of strangers passing by, each one wrapped in the quiet drama of their own existence. The world, I realized, had not paused for my private war. It had continued its relentless, chaotic, and beautiful churn, utterly oblivious to the collapse of my own small dynasty. There was a profound and unsettling comfort in that realization. My struggle, which had consumed my entire being, was but a single invisible thread in a vast and complex tapestry. When I finally reached my own street, the familiar quiet of the neighborhood felt different. It was not the oppressive quiet of isolation, but the calm, settled quiet of sanctuary. The house stood at the end of the walk, solid and unassuming, its windows catching the afternoon light. It was no longer a fortress to be defended or a prize to be fought over. It was simply my home. I fitted the key in the lock, the same as I had done tens of thousands of times before, but the sensation was different. The click of the tumbler was not just the sound of a lock opening, it was the sound of a sentence being commuted, of a cage dissolving. I stepped inside. The silence that greeted me was not the hollow void I had returned to after the first day of the hearing. It was a gentle, welcoming silence. It was the sound of peace. I did not go to my study, not at first. I walked to the kitchen and performed the simple, grounding ritual of brewing a pot of coffee, the familiar aroma a welcome and normalizing scent. Cup in hand, I went to the living room and sat, not in my own chair, but in the floral print wingback that had always been Martha's. I looked around the room, at the objects that had been silent witnesses to my ordeal, the photographs on the mantel, the books on the shelves, the piano in the corner. They were all still here. They had weathered the storm. The feeling that washed over me was not happiness. Happiness is a bright, fleeting thing, an emotion I associated with a past that was now irrevocably gone. This was something else. It was a quiet, profound sense of equilibrium, the feeling an auditor gets when the final column balances to zero, when all accounts have been reconciled. Later, I went to my study. The court had returned the dossier to me, and it sat on my desk, a thick, silent monument to a painful chapter of my life. I picked it up, but did not open it. There was no need. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my largest filing cabinet, a drawer filled with the records of the most difficult and significant audits of my career. I placed the dossier inside, alongside the files of corporations and fraudsters I had brought to account decades ago. It belonged there. It was a closed case. I shut the drawer, the sound of the metal sliding home a final, satisfying punctuation mark. I had survived. My integrity was intact. My home was my own. But the victory was a quiet, somber thing. In order to save my own life, I had been forced to formally document the moral and ethical bankruptcy of my own children. I had won my freedom, but the price had been the final, acknowledged loss of my family. I had audited my own heart and found it solvent, but irreparably diminished. As evening fell, I sat in the growing darkness of my study, the house wrapped in its quiet peace. I was free.